Welcome to Automation Experts. I'm your host, Mark Pfender, former submarine officer turned process controls engineer. In this podcast series, we're interviewing experts from all over the nation in industrial process controls and automation. I'm excited to share with you the history of where we came from and where we're going next. Hello and welcome to Automation Experts, where we're hearing the untold stories of process automation and control. Today I'm joined by special guest, Dave Neal. And Dave, as a way of getting started, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, thanks for inviting me.
It's good.
This is a first for us. So I've been in this industry ever since I left school. When I was 16, I was born in England, and I was born in a town called Grimsby in the northeast of England. And at that time, back in the early 60s, you left school and you went to look for a job. And in my case, I got an opportunity to apply for an apprenticeship at a local chemical company, a company called ICI, big conglomerate chemical company with installations throughout the world. And this particular company made titanium pigment, which is used in the base for making paint.
Okay.
And I, along with a bunch of other kids, we applied for this apprenticeship, and there were 6 places for the apprenticeships. And I was fortunate to win one of those places. And for the next 5 years, I joined this program as an apprentice tradesman. And in that time, we were given an opportunity to go to a college as well, 1 day a week and 2 nights a week. And we got a certification in the trade for which we were being challenged on a day-to-day basis. Anyway, at the beginning, it was pretty basic stuff. And for the first 6 months, we had to make our own tools. I still use some of mine in my workshop at home. So I'm kind of proud of that.
In my head, I'm picturing a wooden mallet, but like, what are the actual tools, or what?
These were all metal.
Like you had to forge them, and
not forge them, but we had to machine them, and in most cases, file them, saw them. In fact, almost all of it was done by hand, although there was the machinery there to make it, automate it. But we were challenged with our hands to see if we could put these things together. So we made vices and scribes and a whole bunch of little devices, which I still use to this day. I make a point, even if they're not as good as like one I could buy in the shop, just to say that I'm still using them. But anyway, after 6 months of that, we were given an opportunity to choose a trade. And this particular plant, which was a big, big place, it covered tens of acres. And so big, in fact, that it was divided up into streets. And one of the streets held the workshops for all of the different trades. I chose a trade which, having no knowledge whatsoever of what it really implied, as an instrumentation artificer, we were called, as an apprentice. And turned out to be a process instrumentation workshop. And it was keeping in mind this was in the early 60s, and it was in the pretty raw stages of plant automation. And I got an opportunity to work on pretty basic instruments which were being used throughout the plant to measure and in some ways control and automate to some level this whole chemical plant. So for the next 5 years, I spent with some pretty ornery, tough engineers who were, keeping in mind at the time, if you think about this, in the early 60s, a lot of the folks who were working there, who were sort of skilled in their relatively new trade, but were learning it themselves, but had recently come out of the services after the Second World War. Yeah. And these were pretty raw guys, so they didn't take fools gladly, but they taught us a lot. And I have to say, after 5 years of that, you felt pretty confident that you could tackle a few things rather than having just gone to school. And so I felt pretty well prepared at that point to start on another part of the career. And myself, along with two other guys, we when we finished our apprenticeships, we left the company and joined a real instrument company, which actually made the instruments that we'd been working on. And it was a company called Kent Instruments, which is, the name has long since gone, but is now part of ABB, better known as Brown Boveri. And they were a big instrument company. And if you're familiar with companies like Leeds and Northrop in the United States, at one time in their lives, before they were integrated into another organization, made everything from casting the instruments to computer systems. And Kent Instruments was one of those. So again, another big learning experience for me, a completely different world. And I joined there as a service engineer.
So take me back to the instrumentation of that era, right? And a lot of our listeners might not understand kind of how we got to where we are today, right? You think measurements easy, we have computers that can fit in the palm of your hands. We can put these microchips everywhere and get the sensors down as small as possible. Where did we start? What was the beginnings of instrumentation back in those days?
I think it began certainly in the plant that, in my experience, was being able to measure processes. And a lot of those measurements, it's interesting that the way we measure device or measure processes today, the primary elements that we use and the technologies that we use really haven't changed a whole lot. But it's the way we use those measurements to apply automation. But in those days, we were busy for the most part measuring anything and everything that moved. And being able to do that, it allowed a manual operator to take actions to run the plant. So I wouldn't call it so much plant automation in the 60s, at least, certainly in my experience, but building this was a pretty new installation at the time, building a plant where we were coming up with various ways to measure every part of the process that we possibly could to try to improve its efficiencies, but in a manual way once we'd made the measurements.
So those measurements that they were being made, was it like it was displayed locally? Like how do you right now we're used to, hey, everything's got a screen on it, everything's got, digital readouts. How did you see the measurements? Or like, you said they were collecting the measurements. What did that?
Well, there's the thing. Keep in mind, you imagine these installations which cover acres and acres of ground, and this was along a dockside, alongside a river, for the very purpose the raw material came in on a ship, and the finished product went out on another ship. But in between, there were acres and acres of land with different parts of the process, and in those days, communications was a real challenge, local communication. So you'd find a part of the process was located in a particular part of the plant, and then the operator will be looking at only the local displays on that part of the plant, and no one anywhere else on the plant would have any knowledge whatsoever of what was really happening. So every piece was pretty well self-contained, with no mechanisms for centralized communications. Fundamental difference to what we enjoy today.
Yeah, and it's so interesting just to see kind of how the world has changed, but how it hasn't. And there's still some of the fundamental challenges that we face today. Mm-hmm. So you moved to Kent. Where did you go from there?
This kind of puts an age on me, doesn't it? But
you're still young at heart, Dave.
This takes us now into the late 60s, 1968, I guess, around there. And at that time in the United Kingdom, the power company was a company called the CEGB, the Central Electricity Generating Board, a state-owned power company. And they were revitalizing the whole power grid throughout the United Kingdom. And in doing that, they were building these massive power stations, all coal-fired at that time. And these were typically Each power station would comprise of 4 generators, and each generator would be generating up to 500 megawatts. So these were big plants. So this was the real world now. I worked in this chemical plant as an apprentice, as a kid. Got pretty confident at what I was doing, really. And so when I joined Kent Instruments, along with these 2 other guys that I'd worked with me as well, they looked at our background and said, this was Kent Instruments now, who had been fortunate to win contracts with the CEGB to provide all of the instrumentation and control systems on several power stations. And these were in the process of being built. So they said, we think you guys would be good at helping commission the equipment. So we said, okay. So we go to these places. These are literally greenfield sites. And these are massive places. I use the word gobsmacked. I'll probably take that out.
That doesn't sound like that sounds like an English slang to me.
Yeah, I walked, my first visit to the power plant, I couldn't believe the size of the boiler. The boiler stood 120 feet high. The turbine generator was 300 feet long. The noise was just, in the building process, never mind the product when it was finished, the plant when it was finished, was just staggering. And the instrumentation, it was beyond imagination from what I'd seen in the past. So much of it. But again, it's interesting, going back now, what, 40, 50 years, almost 50 years, my gosh. The traditional way of making all of the measurements still applied. So we were still measuring pressures, still measuring flows, all of the parameters that go towards driving a boiler and driving a turbine. But this time, we'd found ways to be able to communicate to a central control room. So now this is a big deal. So we're still collecting all the data at a local level, keeping in mind the size of these places. It'd take you half a day to walk the plant. But we found ways to communicate with these localized displays to a central control station. So you see the pictures now, you see in the movies, the central control panels that we're more familiar with. And that's when we began to see that, in my experience, taking all of those measurements that we're making and finding a better way and a more efficient way of taking advantage of them.
By writing them down on paper? That was the first step in the evolution?
The localized displays didn't have any paper, but the remote displays, the control panels, were loaded with paper recorders. And it was a data-driven, like it is today, really, a data-driven business, but collecting rolls and rolls and sheets of paper, round charts, fan fold charts, as we like to call them, but lots and lots of paper and analyzing data on paper.
Fast forward from there, you eventually made it to America. What brought you here, or why did you come to America?
I often ask myself the same question. As a service engineer, we completed this particular power station. We completed the commissioning. Took 4 years, and I'd bought a house quite close to it in the meantime, and got married. And so I was looking for an opportunity that kept me local to where this power plant was. But the last thing I wanted to do was spend the rest of my life working on a power station. And the guy I worked with on the power plant happened to see an ad in a local newspaper one day, and it was looking for a sales engineer in the company that I worked for, Kent Instruments. And so I went for an interview and finished up getting a job as a sales engineer in the territory where I lived. I thought, this is a lucky break. So a whole new adventure now, from being an apprentice to a service engineer to being, in quotation marks, a sales engineer, of which I had no understanding whatsoever of what that implied. And where I lived, in addition to all of the power stations that were being built, there was a lot of other industry. The chemical plant I used to work at, along with many others, a lot of steel industries as well. And I was fortunate, and having not even realized it at the time, but this company, Kent Instruments, was a juggernaut of a company. And it was probably one of the leading companies in the United Kingdom in the instrumentation industry. And being a sales engineer, it was a ready-made sales opportunity. People wanted to buy your equipment because there was nothing else to buy. So you went out to solve problems rather than to sell. And it's fundamentally different. So the word sales engineer is a broadly used term, but it has two different meanings. And if you're working for a company that's already extremely well established, it's much easier to sell. A real sales engineer starts from scratch, and there's a big difference. So that took me. So in working for Kent Instruments and working for this guy, he left eventually after a few years, and joined a company called Chessel, which was a startup company, and it was part of an organization owned by a company called Eurotherm. And he'd been there a few weeks, and he called me up and he said, "Dave, you should come down and check this company out." He said, "This is really interesting. There's not many of us here, but they make recorders, chart recorders for the process instrument industry. And they've got some really clever ideas. And they've spun off this division within the Eurotherm group. And a man by the name of Brian Chessel had taken it out of the Eurotherm group, still owned by Eurotherm, but created this separate company."
Well, and I'm going to pause you there. For any of our listeners that don't know what a chart recorder is, can you explain what that is, or what does that look like?
What it used to be,
what it used to be, or still is.
Still is, yeah. In fact, one of the means to archive data that we're collecting, we're so busy collecting today and archiving it in so many different ways. Well, in those days, virtually the only way of collecting it in the process industry was either writing it down manually as you looked at an analog reading. I use the word analog because that's all there was at the time. There wasn't a digital display. Or alternatively, finding a way to record it automatically with a pen and paper. Sounds pretty basic, doesn't it? And that's trickier than it sounds, trust me. So you'll see the circular recorders today, which we'll still see many times in the municipal industry particularly. There's still a favored way of archiving data. But a chart recorders in our case was using a roll chart. And that gave an advantage right away if you think about it, because the circular chart has only got so much room on it to record data. It rotates probably once a day or once a week, and you've got to take it out and replace it. Oh, revolution here. A roll chart, which is a pretty long piece of paper, takes a lot longer to get used, so you don't change it quite as often. Yeah. So here's a real advance in the recording industry. But the real challenge is not so much the paper, but getting the pen to write on the paper. So, and this is
I've never thought about this before.
It's pretty basic stuff, isn't it? But you know what? This is how the world works, right? It starts from simple beginnings. And one of the benefits of Chessel was they found a way of capillary action of getting the pen to write on the paper continuously without drying up, which, I'm not kidding, was a revolution in itself. So we were building this recorder, which had some really clever techniques in it, which I could go into in some detail, but getting into the weeds there. But the bottom line is, at the end of the day, all the customer was concerned about was, does my recorder write on paper, and can I look at it at a later date and still read what it wrote? And this device did that really well. So I had joined Chessel, and we, as a startup company, and we developed the sales in the United Kingdom. Timing is everything, and going back a little bit, keeping in mind where I'd started my career and moved into the power stations as well. Well, these power stations, they were so big, they'd been developed and designed 10 years before they were built. And the equipment that was being used on them was already 10 years old when it was installed. It's a bit like building a submarine, really. And when the devices that were installed were being installed, we were saying to ourselves, there's a much better way of doing this now. But the equipment had already been bought. So when I joined this company, Chesil, I remembered those conversations. I went back to the power stations where I'd been working, said, hey guys, those recorders that you put in, which are already 10 years old, take a look at this. And sure enough, like I said, timing is everything. So literally the power plants throughout the United Kingdom, I'm guessing on the number, there's probably 15, 20 of them. And each one of these would have 150, 200 recorders in them.
Yeah.
Guess what? They all turned into Chesil recorders. So that was the evolution of that. And so I was able to make my mark through pure good luck, really, in selling Chesil recorders. And the sales manager of the company, who I got along with really well, decided that he was going to come to the United States. And he came over here to help start up Chesil in the United States. And a year or so after he arrived, it seems like an old story now, but he called me up and said, hey, Dave, you should come take a look at this. So I came over here and with my wife, and I'd never been to the United States before. Now we're in 1980, 1979, 1980. And I came over to the US with my wife and take a look and see if we could find a way to live here. I was pretty apprehensive about that, I have to say. I was enjoying my life in England, and it was going good. You know, it's going great. I had nothing to complain about. And this was, again, a startup business over here.
Right. You'd never been here. You'd never sold in the United States. You didn't understand fundamentally the market. The landscape, I imagine, was a little bit different, right? Maybe a little bit more spread out than England.
Oh gosh, you're not kidding. I had no perception of distance whatsoever. And it takes so long to get everywhere. You know, I could drive from one end of England to the other in the same day.
Yeah. I
can't do Pennsylvania in the same day any longer. But yeah, it was very different. And I came here for a week, borrowed my boss's car, destroyed a wheel on a pothole in Pennsylvania.
It's still the case today, by the way. You know?
Oh yeah, nothing has changed. Yeah. And at the end of it, I said, you know what? I don't think I can do this. And I left and went back home and let it lie.
Yeah.
And then about 6 months later, my old boss's boss called me up, and it was like 1 o'clock in the morning in England. I guess he'd forgotten the time difference. And he said, hey, Dave, he said, will you reconsider that? And this is 1 o'clock in the morning. I'm not kidding. And I said, okay. I have no idea.
You didn't talk to Pam at all?
I must have lost my mind. And anyway, one thing led to another. And we came out again, brought my 2 girls, at the time were very young. And we came to the United States in 1980.
Well, I want to highlight there the fundamentals. You were selling paper and pens, right? And you look at it and you think, what's so special? You know, what's so special, or what's so, you know? But at the time, that was a need, right? And you solved a problem that people had. Mm-hmm. You know, you had all of the United States, right? It was your territory. You were selling everywhere. I
started off. I think my boss was being kind to me, and he said we'd already established a few distribution channels before I got here, mainly through Eurotherm, who were already here as a completely independent company. So we knew a few people, but I had a direct responsibility for the Northeast, territory that we're more familiar with in NSI right now, but on a broader scale, the US as well. Yeah.
How did you get around? Did you have any means of traveling the United States, or what was your go-to-market strategy to tell people about pens and paper?
When I first came, I didn't have a clue. I truly did not have a clue. I had no experience of working through representation, through third-party representation. I didn't know how we went to market with products. My naivety makes my toes curl. In fact, we see that today with companies that we work with who are not necessarily familiar with companies in the United States.
You arrived as a salesman in the United States. You're selling, your goal was, how can we help people with pens and chart recorders?
Well, you remember I mentioned in the past that working for that company called Kent Instruments, I was hired as a sales engineer, and I realized when I came to the United States, and actually probably earlier when I joined Chesil in England, the difference between a sales engineer and a salesman.
Yeah.
And there's a fundamental difference. And when you taking a company or a product to a completely different market, who have no knowledge of the company, the product, or yourself, it's a completely different experience. And so I certainly had to change the way I looked at business, really. And you have to create an awareness. The fact that you even exist is the first challenge. So that for me was certainly the single biggest problem, really. And keeping in mind the communication mechanisms we had available to us back in doesn't seem that long ago, really, but in the early 80s, we were still using the telephone, and we still do, of course, but the routine would be, I've just arrived in America. I work for this company, Chesil. Chesil who? And could I come and introduce myself and show you what we've got? And some customers were more fascinated in, I have to say, in me and the guy who talked funny rather than the product that I was selling, I think. And I think, again, it's a bit of luck, really. I was pretty successful in being able to go and see people. I found that, and that was the key, to get in front of somebody and to be passionate about what you were talking about, because I was pretty excited about what I had. I thought this is good stuff. This thing really works. And you go and see the customer, and he was saying, "So where are you from, Dave? What's it like over there? I've never been. I think, can we talk about this? I want to talk about my product, But I found that it was actually a real good door opener, the fact that there was a fascination in yourself. You were selling the key. You were selling yourself. And in selling yourself, you found that there was a real interest developed in what you were selling. And for me, that was how it started.
I heard there was a rumor that at one point you had an RV, and you were using the RV to kind of as the demo RV.
Well, yeah, there's this development, realizing that I had a pretty parochial idea on sales in the US, keeping in mind where I'd been in England, a country the size of Pennsylvania. So challenged with the job of selling in the United States, to think, how do you do that? Well, the fundamental difference is the fact that we realize that you can't do it all by yourself. So we'd already set up a pretty mismatch of representation throughout the US. Some were just names on a piece of paper without really knowing who they were. But if anybody called in Louisiana, then we had a name for the customer to talk to. But none of these people or the customers really had any idea about what we were doing as a company. Yeah. So we figured that the only way to do it was to get in front of them ourselves. And so we bought this demo van. It was built by a company called Bath out of Ohio. I don't think they even exist any longer. It was a 28-foot demo van, and we had a little kitchen built in the back, so we could put the coffee on. It had a drop-down bed at the front, which I don't think anybody ever used, but it was one we could sleep in it. But we fitted it out with the product. We had one product that we sold from Chesil, and it was utilized, keeping in mind chart recorders, like any data archiving device, gets used everywhere in any industry, whether it's pharmaceutical, petrochemical, municipal. Color sometimes defines its function, whether it was black, gray, white.
Right.
So we would put different numbers of pens on it, different colors, and we peppered the demo van with a variety of the same product, and kitted it out, and decided that we would take it around the United States ourselves, and also share it with some of our third-party sales companies if they wanted to use it.
I can't imagine that it fits everywhere you want it to fit.
We could have a whole new podcast on the adventures of the demo van. But bringing it back from the plant, from the factory, one of the guys that worked for us, by this time we'd actually developed an inside sales group, and we had a couple of guys we called regional managers, and
never heard of these guys.
One of the guys' jobs was to bring the van from Ohio. Well, this thing had a radio aerial on the top of it, and I guess driving through Pennsylvania, day one, didn't take any account of any of the low bridges, of which there are numerous throughout Pennsylvania. So we managed to displace the radio aerial on its first visit across Pennsylvania. But I remember in the very early days, we gave it to one of our we had 2 or 3 salesmen by this time, and we gave it to one of our salesmen to take out to somewhere in the Midwest. And it was a multiple night, overnight stay. So the first night he booked into a Holiday Inn, and still had same guy, actually, same driver. Didn't take account of the fact. If you remember the Holiday Inn, most Holiday Inns today, even the reception area has some kind of awning outside.
Yeah.
And as he drove into the reception area, didn't take account of the width of the demo van. He was pretty new at driving this thing, and it was pretty big. He took out one of the pillars on the awning of the Holiday Inn, managed to back out the truck along with the pillar, and the whole roof of the awning came down in front of the hotel. And he called me up and said, "Dave, we have a problem." Fortunately, we were insured.
Yeah.
There are so many stories. I don't know if you want to develop any of those.
Well, so I am curious. There was another story about a product you sold related to cows, and I'm just curious. Can you give us the background? Like, what did chart recorders have to do with cows, and what was the name of the product?
That's music to my ears.
Oh,
forget that one.
Yeah, no, we're gonna keep that one.
Take that one out. It's interesting, isn't it? You think of a chart recorder, think pretty humdrum, really, but it truly got you into every facet and every application you could possibly imagine. And I don't quite remember how this began now. This was in England, but we had a call one day, and it was from some agricultural enterprise. And again, going back to the power industry, there'd been an advance within the power distribution systems throughout the United Kingdom in the 60s and 70s, and a complete revamping of power generation and power distribution.
Yeah. And
that led to a lot of electrical pylons being installed throughout the country. And you keep in mind the size of these things, and they're typically installed in open spaces. Farmland is a great spot to put them, in fact. And so you'll find a pylon in a field, and draped across the pylons are the cables carrying the power. But underneath the cables, it probably is a cow field.
Yeah.
And the challenge, it turned out that there was an induced power into the ground from the magnetic field around the cable. And most cows, if they're lucky, have 4 legs. And it turns out that there was a potential difference between the cow's front legs and its back legs when it was in a field where there was a power distribution cable running over the top of it.
Yeah. And
some of the cows were electrocuted and sadly died. And this was a real problem. So, and there are a lot of insurance issues and a lot of investigation as to why it was happening. In the beginning, nobody realized what was happening until they did. So we got a call to say, is there any way to measure the potential difference between the front legs and the back legs of a cow?
Yeah.
So we built a recorder with an AC input channel, measuring a very low voltage. And we tested it out, and we'd put 2 stakes in the field and measure the difference between the 2 stakes, which were roughly the length of a cow, and realized that we can measure this.
Yeah.
And sure enough, we offered the Moo Moo recorder, and it became a real product.
And did you guys label it that? Like, was there a?
That was the fun label in the company. It was a serious business. Although it sounds funny, but it was we would get a call in the sales office to say we got another call from Moo Moo recorder, but in fact it was just an AC voltage recorder.
Yeah. From those times and those adventures, you've seen the industry change, right? And some of it's changed for the good, some of it's changed for the bad. Why are you still passionate about what you do?
I really love it. I've been very fortunate with the people I've worked with, both in the companies that I've worked for and in the people that work for me. I've enjoyed the company of the people, the experiences they've given me, and the technology is fascinating. It's constantly evolving. You never stop learning. And the basic principles still apply always, in terms of whether it's the instrumentation, the way you treat people. But nevertheless, the reason I stay in it, because of all I've ever done since I left school when I was 16. But nevertheless, it's I find that the fact that it's constantly growing, you never stop learning.
Yeah, and there's a passion about every day is never going to be the same. It's not going to be the same as yesterday. The technology is not going to be the same. What we're fundamentally doing is helping people, but how we do it is going to change every day.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine that you're somebody that is just getting into the field, whether you're maybe a new engineer fresh out of college, or you're just coming to your first manufacturing plant. Maybe you're coming to an engineering firm. What piece of advice do you have for those people just getting started in this industry?
Well, I think the first challenge is making this industry attractive to those that potentially might be successful in it. And I don't think we're very good at that. I have a sense, and I could be wrong, I'm 3 generations, at least 2 and possibly 3 generations removed from those that are looking at joining the workforce.
Yeah.
And maybe we don't look very attractive as an industry. I think there might be what look like more exciting things to do in the engineering field. I think there's a real underestimation of what this industry really is about, and the fact that it takes you just about anywhere and everywhere in anything that's made, anything that's built, anything we buy has resulted from a piece of instrumentation that's being measuring it and controlling it.
Yeah.
And it gets us involved just about everywhere. So I think we haven't been very good. I don't think we are very good at selling the fascination of this industry and how it's growing, how it's developing, and the technology, how it's driving it as well.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate your insights today, Dave. I really enjoyed kind of just seeing some of the history, and we're looking forward to where the future is going. Close us out. Is there anything that you wanted to give to our listeners?
I think to be aware of the fact that how this technology drives the instrumentation industry as a whole, and how we're genuinely trying to take advantage of all of the new technology that's available, particularly going back to where we first began this conversation. We said that most of the instrumentation, most of the control systems, most of the processes that we control are driven by the measurements that we make. That's what we do, but the way we adapt those measurements is what's really a big part of that, and taking advantage of cloud-based solutions, archiving data, the way we collect data, the way that we use it now. Well, the instrumentation industry is really a big part of that. Yeah. And so never underestimate what might appear to be an old-fashioned business. It truly isn't. It's really on the cutting edge of technology, and we're right in the front of it.
Awesome. Well, I'm looking forward to see where the future goes. And to all of our listeners out there, again, thank you for listening to Automation Experts. You can catch us again at our next episode. I'm your host, Mark Pfender. Thank you for joining. Thanks for listening to this episode of Automation Experts. Automation Experts is sponsored by Neal Systems, your process controls and industrial automation provider in Northeastern United States. Learn more at nealsystems.com.